All right, you guys really went deep this time. A whole chapter from this textbook, Engineering the Fluid, and a stack of other stuff on hydraulic fracturing fluids. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, it's pretty wild how this all comes together. You've got engineering, obviously, but the chemistry of these fluids is crazy complex.
Mm.
And then, of course, you can't ignore the environmental side of it.
So I guess it's not just like pumping water down there and hoping for the best.
Definitely not. This engineering the fluid chapter, well, it starts out talking about this ideal fluid, right? Like it's a wish list.
Hmm.
Perfect viscosity, dirt cheap, no fluid loss, zero environmental impact.
Sounds like they're describing a unicorn that also does your taxes.
Right. And, of course, they go on to say that fluid doesn't exist. Real world, you got to compromise somewhere.
Makes sense.
This is-
So where do those compromises usually start? What's the first thing you got to give up on?
Well, a lot of times it's cost. Everybody wants to save a buck.
Right.
But this chapter makes it clear that can backfire big time if your cheap fluid messes up the whole fracking job. And one of the big things they talk about is viscosity.
Okay, yeah. Viscosity. That's like how thick it is, right? Like honey versus water.
Exactly. And you might think thicker is better, right?
Mhm.
Like you need this super thick fluid to really wedge open those fractures. But what's interesting is this chapter actually says being off on that viscosity measurement, it doesn't matter as much as you might think.
Wait, really? That seems kind of counterintuitive. I thought viscosity was like the king of fracking fluid properties.
Oh, it's important, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But the relationship between viscosity and how wide your fracture gets, it's not a one-to-one thing. They even give you an equation. Fracture width is proportional to viscosity, but raised to the 1/4 power.
Math is not my strong suit. So, in plain English, what does that actually mean?
It means even if your viscosity is way off, like double what you thought it was, the fracture width only changes by about 19%.
Huh, okay. So, even if it's a little thinner than we thought, it's still going to make a decent crack.
Exactly. Plus, on top of that, you have what's called leak-off. A lot of that fracturing fluid, it actually leaks off into the rock around the fracture. So that reduces the impact of any, viscosity differences even more.
Oh, I see. So it's like not all of the fluid is even staying where you want it to.
Exactly. And the other thing, measuring viscosity downhole
Mm-hmm.
under all that pressure and temperature, it's insanely hard, even with the best tools we've got.
Starting to see why they call it engineering the fluid. It's not just like following a recipe. You got to really understand all these crazy factors.
Yep. And then you throw in the fact that there are so many different types of fluids. Water-based, oil-based. You've got these energized fluids, foams. They even use acid sometimes.
Sounds like somebody let loose in a chemistry lab.
Kinda. And that's where they bring up this table 9.2. It's like a cheat sheet for picking the right fluid. Lists out all the pros and cons of each type.
I wish I had that table back when I first started learning about this stuff. My head was spinning.
It's definitely helpful. Like, they talk about how water fracs are the simplest, right? Cheap and easy. But the downside is that low viscosity can be a problem. And then you've got linear gels. Those have more viscosity, but you can't reuse them like water. Then there's the cross-linked gels, the real heavy hitters. But those are way more complex to deal with.
So it sounds like every type of fluid, it's got its own pluses and minuses.
Absolutely.
Well.
Then they talk about oil-based fluids, which are used in certain formations that don't play nice with water, but those come with a higher price tag, and then you've got environmental concerns to think about.
Right, oil spills and all that.
And then you've got the really wild ones, foams and polyemulsions, which are supposed to be super clean and efficient, but those can be dangerous because of explosions.
Explosions. Now that's something I didn't think about.
Yeah, it's a real risk. And what it all comes down to is you can't just pick a fluid based on one factor. You got to look at the specific reservoir, how the well is designed, what your overall goals are. It's never a one-size-fits-all situation.
So it's like being a chef. You wouldn't use fish sauce in a chocolate cake, right? Got to pick the right ingredients for the job.
Exactly. And speaking of ingredients, this chapter goes into all these different additives they put in these fluids. It's like tweaking that cake recipe to get the perfect texture. We're talking gelling agents, cross-linkers, breakers, all sorts of stuff.
Oh boy, I'm getting flashbacks to high school chemistry.
Don't worry, no pop quizzes here. But understanding these additives, that's key to understanding why they pick one fluid over another for a particular job.
Okay, so break it down for me. What are these additives all about?
So you've got your gelling agents. Those are the things that thicken up the base fluid. Guar gum, cellulose derivatives, things like that. Then you've got cross-linkers. Those create this super viscosity in certain gels using things like borates or metallic compounds. And then finally, you've got breakers, which are crucial because they make sure the fluid can actually flow biaca out of the formation after they're done fracking.
Wait, so it's not just stuck down there forever, it actually comes back up?
Exactly. And, the history of these additives is kind of wild. This chapter mentions how in the old days, they used to use gasoline gelled with palm oil, and they'd cross-link it with something called naphthenic acid, which you might know better as napalm.
They use napalm to frack wells.
Back then, yeah. Thankfully, research has come a long way. Today's fluids are much safer, much more effective. It's actually pretty amazing how much progress they've made, both in how well they work and in making them more environmentally responsible.
Speaking of the environmental side, I know that's a big concern for a lot of people. And this chapter doesn't shy away from it. They talk about the risks, especially when it comes to contaminating groundwater.
Absolutely. And they take a really balanced approach. They acknowledge how effective fracking is, but
Well,
they also say, hey, we got to look at these chemicals, understand the risks, and do it objectively.
so it's about like looking at the hard data, not just freaking out.
Exactly. And they give you this great table, table 9.1, that lists all the common chemicals they use in fracking fluids, what they're for, their hazard ratings, even quiz ratings from the US and the EU. Now, before you get scared by the long list, a lot of these chemicals, they're only really dangerous in their concentrated form. In the fracking fluid, they're diluted way down, and the table actually shows that the perceived risk, it can vary depending on who's doing the assessment.
So context matters. Don't just freak out based on a name, look at the details. But all this talk about viscosity and different fluid types, how do they actually measure the viscosity of the stuff down in the well? That seems tricky.
Oh, it gets even trickier than that. They talk about these things called rheological models, which might sound scary, but it's really just different ways to describe how the fluid flows. Think about honey dripping slowly versus water splashing all over the place. That's kind of what we're talking about.
Okay, I can picture that. So is there like a go-to model they use for fracking fluids?
Yeah, the most common one they use is the power law model. It helps them understand this thing called shear thinning behavior, which basically means the faster the fluid flows, the thinner it seems to get.
Wait, so the same fluid can act differently depending on how fast it's moving. That's weird.
It is. But here's where it gets really interesting. The speed that the fluid flows down in the fracture, it's different from what you can measure in a lab. So those lab measurements, they might not be totally accurate.
So they're making these big decisions based on data that might not even be right. That seems like a recipe for disaster.
It's a valid concern, and it actually ties back to what we were saying before about how the viscosity doesn't have to be perfectly precise. And then they bring up another layer of complexity, which is the proppant. They start talking about prop and fall rates and how that plays into everything.
Right, because we're not just pumping fluid, we're pumping this mixture of fluid A&D proppant to hold those fractures open.
You got it. And adding proppant to the fluid, it changes the viscosity. Think about adding sand to water, how it gets thicker. It's kind of like that, but of course, it's more complicated than that.
Oh boy, here we go again. I'm already feeling a little overwhelmed.
Well, the good news is they walk you through all the different factors they have to consider. Shear rate correction, slurry correction, fall rate correction, even temperature correction. It's like a recipe with a million ingredients.
You're definitely making my head spin.
But to show you how all this works, they actually give you an example calculation. And what it shows is a fluid that seems thin in the lab, it can actually be fantastic at transporting proppant downhole once you take all those corrections into account.
So it's like they're predicting the future of this fluid deep underground.
In a way, yeah. They're using all these models and data to make smart decisions about how the fluid's going to behave in this crazy complex environment.
Wow. I'm starting to get a sense of just how much planning and expertise goes into this. It's like a carefully choreographed dance, but miles beneath the surface.
It really is. But it's not just about the technical stuff. This chapter also gets into some of the real-world challenges and controversies that come with fracking fluids.
You mean like the environmental impact?
You got it. And we'll dive into that right after a quick break. And, just like with a dance, they got to plan out each step. These engineers, they design these fluids to do specific things down in the well. It's not enough to just, pick a type E of fluid. You got to really tailor it for the job.
So it's like having a basic recipe, but then you add different spices to get different flavors.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And one of the tools they use to do this is something called the viscosity curve. Basically, it shows you how the viscosity changes over time. Because that fluid, it doesn't just sit still down there. It's exposed to different temperatures, pressures, all sorts of chemical reactions happening.
So it's not just about the viscosity at one point in time, it's how it changes throughout the whole fracking process. That makes sense.
Exactly. And this chapter goes into all these different things engineers have to think about when they're designing these curves. One of them is something called the stage length, which is basically how long each pumping phase lasts during the fracking operation.
So a longer stage would need a different viscosity profile than a shorter one.
Yep, exactly. A longer stage might need a fluid that can hold its viscosity for a longer time, while a shorter stage, they might use a fluid that peaks early and then breaks down quickly. It all depends.
That makes sense. What else do they have to factor in?
Well, the formation temperature is another big one. We've already talked about how temperature affects viscosity,
Hmm.
but it's especially important when you're designing these curves.
Right, because heat usually thins things out, so they need to take into account how hot it gets down there in that specific formation.
Exactly. They got to make sure the fluid can handle the heat without, losing its mojo. It's got to
Mm.
perform the way they need it to, even in those extreme conditions.
Okay, I'm following so far. Any other wrinkles they have to iron out?
Oh, always.
Yeah.
One thing they talk about that I thought was pretty cool is something called delayed cross-linking. Remember those cross-linked gels, the ones with that super high viscosity?
Yeah, the heavy hitters.
Well, sometimes you don't want that thick gel to form right away. You might need it to travel a certain distance down the wellbore before it gets to that peak viscosity.
So it's like a time release capsule, but for viscosity.
You got it. Delayed cross-linking basically lets the engineers control when and where that gel forms, so they can make sure the fluid behaves exactly the way they want it to throughout the whole fracturing process. Pretty neat, huh?
Yeah, that's pretty clever. I'm really starting to see just how much planning goes into these operations. It's like a carefully choreographed dance, but instead of on a stage, it's happening thousands of feet underground.
It really is.
Yeah.
But it's not all just technical stuff. This chapter also gets into some of the real-world challenges and controversies that come with fracking fluids.
You mean like the environmental impact? That's definitely a hot button issue.
For sure. And they address that head on. They acknowledge the concerns about these fluids potentially contaminating groundwater, which of course is a serious issue.
Of course, nobody wants their drinking water getting messed up.
Right. And while they point out that modern fracking fluids are designed to be much less harmful than the stuff they used in the past, they don't try to sugarcoat it. They say, look, well, construction is important, monitoring is important, proper waste disposal. All these things are critical to make sure nothing bad happens.
So it's about taking this holistic approach and always trying to do better.
Exactly. And one way they're doing that is by looking at these green fracturing fluids.
I've heard that term, but what exactly makes a fracking fluid green?
Well, the definition is kind of still evolving, but the basic idea is these green fluids, they're designed to be more environmentally friendly. That could mean using less toxic chemicals or picking materials that break down more easily in the environment.
So it's like swapping out the harsh chemicals for something more eco-friendly.
Exactly. And the chapter points out that there's a ton of research happening in this area. Scientists are looking into using plant-based gelling agents, plant-based cross-linkers. It's pretty exciting stuff.
That's really cool. But I'm guessing those green fluids are probably more expensive, right?
Well, there's often a trade-off there. They might cost more upfront, but they argue that in the long run, it can actually save you money. Like if a fluid breaks down easily, you might not have to spend as much on cleanup or waste disposal.
So it's not just about the sticker price of the fluid itself. It's about looking at the bigger economic and environmental picture.
You got it. And as people become more aware of environmental issues, I think we're going to see even more demand for these greener solutions.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's fascinating to see how all these things are connected, the science, the engineering, the economics. It's a whole web.
It really is. And, this chapter doesn't stop there. They also get into this whole other aspect, which is the fluid's ability to carry proppant. That's a big deal because that proppant is what keeps those fractures open. Right.
It's like the scaffolding that holds everything up.
Exactly. And they talk about how viscosity plays a huge role in that. A thicker fluid is better at suspending those proppant particles, keeping them from settling out and clogging things up.
So it's like a delivery truck, making sure those tiny proppant particles get where they need to go.
Perfect analogy. But, of course, it's never that simple. They also point out that the size and density of the proppant matters, too.
That makes sense. A smaller, lighter proppant would be easier to carry than a bigger, heavier one.
You got it. So the engineers, they got to balance the fluid viscosity with the proppant characteristics, the flow rates.
Right.
It's all got to work together. And it's not just about getting it down there. It's about making sure that proppant is distributed evenly throughout the whole fracture.
Okay, so it's not like just dumping a pile of sand at the bottom. It's about spreading it out strategically.
Exactly. And that's where this concept of proppant settling comes in. Basically, those proppant particles, they want to settle out of the fluid over time. And how fast that happens, it depends on things like the fluid viscosity, the proppant density, even how wide the fracture is. It's a lot to keep track of.
So it's back to that balancing act again.
Always. They talk about all these techniques engineers use to control proppant settling and make sure it's spread out evenly. Different types of proppants, adjusting the flow rates, even tailoring how the fluid's viscosity changes over time. It's pretty impressive stuff.
I'm starting to appreciate just how much finesse goes into these operations. It's not just brute force pumping. It's about understanding all these subtle details.
You're getting it. Yeah. And they even get into some of the advanced models and simulations they use to optimize all this.
Okay, that's why I might need to take notes.
Don't worry, the main point is proppant transport. It's a crucial piece of the whole fracking puzzle. And it requires a deep understanding of how fluids work, how proppant behaves, and the characteristics of that specific reservoir. It's a whole science unto itself.
It really is amazing. But with all this technical stuff, it's easy to forget what the ultimate goal is, and that's to get more oil and gas out of the ground, right?
That's right. That's the whole point of fracking, to increase production from the well. And choosing the right fluid, it's a big part of that, but it's not the only part.
You got to think about the fracture geometry, where that proppant ends up, what the reservoir is like. It's all connected.
Exactly. And this chapter, it does a great job of tying all those pieces together, showing how they all influence each other to determine whether or not that fracking job is successful.
It's like a symphony where all the different instruments have to play their part to make it sound good.
I like that. And like any great conductor, the fracturing engineer, they got to have a deep understanding of all those instruments and how to make them work together harmoniously.
Well, my brain is definitely feeling a little overloaded right now, but in a good way. This deep dive has given me a whole new appreciation for the science and engineering behind fracking.
Yeah,
It's way more complex than I ever realized.
that's great to hear. And remember, we're just scratching the surface here. There's so much more to learn about this topic, and it's always changing. But I think we need to take a breather and let all this information sink in.
Agreed. A quick breather would be good. We'll be back in a flash with some final thoughts on our exploration of this wild world of fracking fluids.
All right, we're back. And hopefully our brains have had a little time to defrazzle after all that. We've gone deep on viscosity, additives, environmental stuff, even those green fluids. It's amazing how much goes into this.
Yeah, thinking back on it all, it really hits you. Picking the right fluid, it's this crazy balancing act. Like, there's no one answer, right? You got to understand the reservoir, what you're trying to achieve with the frac, the risks. It's a lot.
It's definitely not as simple as I thought it was.
No way. It's more like, playing chess, but with really high stakes. And the board keeps changing too, right? As technology gets better, as we learn more about how all this stuff works down there.
That's kind of intimidating. How do these engineers keep up with all that change and make sure they're not making a bad move?
Well, they got to stay on top of things. This chapter, it really emphasizes that. Continuous learning, connecting with other experts, sharing knowledge. That's how they stay ahead of the curve. So it's not about, like, one person being the expert on everything. It's about being open to new ideas and always questioning what you think you know.
Exactly. And, this chapter even gives you a glimpse of what the future might hold. They talk about these things called nanofluids, which, well, they use these tiny particles to basically supercharge the fluid's properties. And then there are these self-healing gels, which, it sounds crazy, but they can actually repair themselves if they get damaged down in the well.
That's wild. Like something out of a sci-fi movie. Makes you wonder what else they'll come up with.
Yeah, who knows what's next. But the point is, these advancements, they could totally change the way we frack, make it more efficient, more effective, and, yeah, better for the environment, too.
Sounds like a field that's full of, like, challenges and possibilities.
Definitely both.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so interesting, right? As we keep pushing into these unconventional resources, the role of these fluids, it's only going to get bigger.
It really is a hidden world down there, a whole lot of science going on that most people never even think about.
And when you really dig into it, it's amazing. It shows you how much ingenuity goes into this industry.
Well, I'm glad WE dug into it. It's given me a lot to think about. But before we go, I want to leave everyone with one last thought. You know how the chapter said the ideal fracking fluid doesn't exist? We're always going to have to compromise somewhere. But what if, through all this research and development, we could actually get closer to that ideal? What if we could create a fluid that's truly sustainable, effective, A&D safe. It's a tough challenge, for sure, but it's also a huge opportunity.
I think you hit the nail on the head. And it's an opportunity we got to take seriously. We need to be creative. We need to be committed to doing things the right way because the future of energy, maybe even the future of the planet, might depend on it.
It's not just about engineering a fluid, it's about engineering a better future.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder all that.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the wild world of hydraulic fracturing fluids. Until next time, keep those brains working.